Hello world, my name is Mohit Deshpande, and in this video we're going to talk about the different kinds of numbers that exist in Swift. So first of all, let's start with the integer. So I'm going to declare a variable here. I'm going to explicitly say that I can only hold an integer. So what is an integer? Well, an integer is just a whole number with no fractional component. Now they can either be what we call signed or unsigned. If it's signed, that means the value of the integer can be either positive, 0, or negative. If it's unsigned, that means it can only be positive or 0. So right now what I've declared here is a variable that I said that it can only store integer values, and it's implied that it can store signed integer values. So I can say x equals negative 23 or x equals negative 1,000. Now how would I make this unsigned, meaning I can only store 0 or positive? I would put a u in front of it. So now it can only store positive values, so let me try to store a negative value. And it should give me a warning. Right, so I can't store negative values unless it's signed. Okay, so now how would I store a decimal component to it? Right, so say I have some number and I want a decimal component to it. Well, in that case we have two different types, but more likely you're going to be using one more than the other, and they're called double. You can either give it a double or a float. Now the difference between a double and a float is kind of a more technical definition. It's really that a double is a 64-bit number and a float is a 32-bit number, but in most cases you can use a double. Right, and now with a double I can store something like 5.16. Okay, so now we're going to talk kind of briefly about what type inference is. So say I just have var x equals 5. If I declare this, it's implied that x is an integer. But now if I change it to something like 5.5, now it's implied to be a double. Now when you have these decimal values, I said that a float or a double can both have decimal components, but Swift will always choose double rather than float. So in this case, the value of x, the type of x I should say, is a double rather than a float. Now there are other ways that we can kind of enhance these numbers, and that's through what we call literals. So right now I have a decimal number, but see, I can turn it into a binary number with this OB prefix and then a series of ones and zeros, because that's what binary is in. I can make it into an octal with 0O. I can make it into hex with a 0x and then something like, say, 4f. I can even have exponential notation where I can say something like 5.6 E3, and that's 5,600. Okay, so let's briefly talk about some things we can do to numbers without actually changing their values. So, for example, say I have some really large number with a lot of zeros, right? In this case, the right-hand pane, it says it's 1 billion. But to someone reading over this, it might not be terribly obvious. So something you can do is you can put underscores, and it won't change the value. So the underscores will really help to make it more readable. So really quickly, I want to talk about one final thing about this keyword called type alias. And what type alias can do is it simply does what its name says. I can make an alias for another type. So say I want to refer to an integer, an unsigned integer, meaning it can only be positive, but it makes more sense in the context to call it something else. So in this case, let's say I have something called file size, but it makes more sense in my context to call it something like file size rather than uint. So now I can actually say something like var x file size. Now under the hood it's converted into uint, but for someone reading this, it just might be more helpful in the context of the situation. So in this video we talked about the different kinds of numbers that exist: integers, signed, unsigned integers. We talked about doubles and floats. We also talked about how Swift does its inference and how we can kind of put in those underscores to make numbers more readable. And we ended with type alias. I hope to see you all in the next video.